I knew something was wrong the moment my son hesitated before inviting me. Daniel had never stumbled over words with me before, not even as a child, but that evening his voice carried the careful tone of someone rehearsing a script. He told me Sophia's parents wanted to host a small dinner so they could finally get to know me properly. He used the word properly twice, and that repetition caught my attention more than anything else. I asked him what that meant, and he laughed in that tight way people do when they want to soften the truth. He said they were simply traditional and valued transparency within family structures. Transparency. I built an entire company in the cybersecurity world. I understand when a word is being weaponized. Transparency doesn't mean warmth. It means disclosure. It means assessment. And in that moment, I realized I was not being invited as a guest. I was being invited as a question mark. For most of Daniel's life, I allowed him to believe we were comfortably ordinary. I never corrected the assumption because it protected him from becoming entitled and protected me from becoming a target. 3 years ago, I sold my cybersecurity firm for $48 million after building it from nothing but exhaustion and refusal to quit. I spent 2 decades fighting in rooms filled with men who underestimated me, and I learned to let silence work in my favor. Wealth, when exposed too early, changes the way people breathe around you. It distorts affection and invites calculation. So I kept my success private, even from my own son. I lived in the same townhouse, drove the same understated car, and wore the same simple watch I'd owned for 15 years. Daniel grew up believing stability came from discipline, not abundance. I thought I was teaching him humility. I did not realize I might also be teaching him to feel small. When I arrived at the Callaway estate that Saturday evening, the property itself felt like a statement carved in stone. Thank you in advance. And what would you do in this person's place? I would love to hear your opinion, so please share it with me in the comments. I'm always curious about what you all think, and also write me where you heard this story. For more life stories like this, like the video and subscribe to my channel. There are many other stories waiting for you. With heartfelt greetings. Until next time. The house wasn't flashy, it was deliberate, curated, built to suggest lineage rather than income. A valet opened my car door, and I caught the flicker in his eyes as he registered the model of my vehicle. I have spent years reading microexpressions. They are more honest than words. Inside, polished floors reflected chandelier light in controlled patterns, and the air carried the faint scent of expensive restraint. Margaret Callaway descended the staircase with a composed smile and extended her hand as though sealing a negotiation. Her grip was firm, lingering just long enough to establish hierarchy. I smiled back with equal steadiness. I have negotiated billion-dollar contracts. A handshake does not intimidate me. But what unsettled me was Daniel's posture. He stood slightly behind Sophia, not beside me. Dinner was structured like a board meeting disguised as hospitality. Assigned seats, measured courses, conversation flowing in predetermined channels. Margaret asked about my education, my late husband, and the scale of my former business. Scale is a financial word, not a casual one, and she used it carefully. I answered with calm simplicity, describing my company as mid-sized and recently sold. Daniel kept his eyes on his wine glass when she pressed for numbers. I noticed that he never once elaborated on my achievements, even when given the opportunity. Instead, he redirected attention back to Sophia's family legacy, reinforcing their stature while minimizing mine. It was subtle but intentional. I realized then that this evening was not about curiosity. It was about classification. They were trying to decide where I fit within their hierarchy, and Daniel was allowing the evaluation to continue uninterrupted. Dessert arrived with quiet precision, and with it came the folder. Margaret placed it beside my plate as if presenting a dessert of its own, her expression perfectly composed. She explained that their family believed in financial clarity before marriages deepened into permanent structures. Inside the folder was a prenuptial agreement draft filled with highlighted clauses protecting Callaway assets and inheritance channels. Then she said, gently but unmistakably, that they would appreciate similar transparency from me. The implication hovered heavily in the air. If I had nothing, I was irrelevant. If I had something, I needed to declare it. I turned to Daniel and asked him whether he knew about this document. He hesitated for half a second before saying yes. That half second pierced deeper than the word itself. He had known. He had agreed. And he had not warned me. In that moment, disappointment replaced irritation. I have endured competitors who tried to bankrupt me and executives who dismissed my intelligence, but nothing compares to realizing your child chose silence over defense. I looked at Daniel not as a strategist, not as a former CEO, but as a mother who once worked through the night to afford his education. I wondered when insecurity began shaping his decisions more than loyalty. Perhaps it started in childhood, when he compared himself to wealthier classmates. Perhaps I misjudged how deeply comparison rooted itself in him. I had believed humility would build strength. Instead, it may have fostered quiet shame. Watching him sit there, avoiding my eyes, I understood something painful. He was afraid of losing his new status. And in that fear, he was willing to let me appear small. I reached into my handbag calmly, not dramatically, and retrieved my phone. There is power in controlled timing, and I have mastered it over decades. I sent a brief message to an old colleague whose firm frequently appeared in financial press archives. Within seconds, Richard Calloway's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen casually at first, then his expression shifted with unmistakable recognition. He looked at me more closely this time, not as an afterthought, but as a discovery. Margaret leaned toward him, confused by the sudden tension tightening his features. He turned the phone slightly so she could see the headline glowing against the dark screen. My name was printed in bold above an article announcing the multi-million-dollar acquisition of my company. The room fell into a silence that no chandelier could soften. Margaret's posture adjusted almost imperceptibly, and the atmosphere transformed from evaluation to recalibration. She asked why I had never mentioned the sale, her tone now edged with curiosity rather than superiority. I replied that no one had asked directly, and that I valued privacy. Daniel finally looked at me fully, confusion battling embarrassment across his face. He had not known the number, he had not known the scale. In trying to protect himself from appearing lesser than his in-laws, he had underestimated me completely. I watched realization dawn in stages, shock, disbelief, and then the slow awareness that he had miscalculated. But the revelation did not feel satisfying. It felt heavy, because this was not about impressing the Calloways. It was about understanding why my own son thought I needed to be managed. Dinner concluded with strained politeness and carefully reconstructed respect. Margaret spoke of future family unity, and Richard asked more measured questions about my former industry. But beneath the civility, something irreversible had occurred. Power had shifted, yes, but so had trust. As I walked toward my car under the cold driveway lights, Daniel followed behind me with hurried steps. The night air felt sharper than before, cutting through the thin layer of composure I maintained inside. He called my name softly, almost like he used to when he needed reassurance after a nightmare. I stopped but did not turn immediately. I needed 1 second to steady myself, not as a businesswoman, but as a mother. When I finally faced him, his eyes were filled with confusion rather than pride. He asked why I never told him the truth, and his voice trembled between accusation and vulnerability. I asked him something far more important in return. I asked whether he had been protecting his marriage tonight or hiding his mother. The question landed visibly, and he struggled to answer. Under the artificial lights of that grand estate, stripped of boardroom authority and financial headlines, we stood as two flawed human beings confronting years of unspoken assumptions. That driveway became more intimate than any dining table inside the mansion. And what Daniel said next would begin to unravel everything I thought I had built, not just in business, but in motherhood. Daniel did not answer me immediately, and that silence stretched longer than the dinner had. The lights along the driveway cast pale shadows across his face, and for the first time since he was a boy, he looked unsure of himself. He ran a hand through his hair the way he used to before admitting he'd broken something. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't defensive, it was small. He said he hadn't been hiding me, just simplifying things so there wouldn't be tension. Simplifying. As if a mother's life could be reduced to avoid discomfort. I asked him what exactly about me required simplification. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. That hesitation told me more than words ever could. He had been afraid of how I would be perceived. He admitted that Sophia's parents had strong opinions about background alignment and generational standing. He said they worried about mismatched families creating long-term complications. Complications. I repeated the word slowly, letting him hear how clinical it sounded. He insisted he didn't agree with them entirely, but he didn't want to challenge them either. That was when I felt the real fracture begin. It wasn't their arrogance that hurt me, it was his neutrality. Neutrality is a choice disguised as peacekeeping. By refusing to defend me, he had quietly sided with the stronger voice in the room. I asked him whether he thought I would embarrass him. His eyes dropped to the pavement, and that was answer enough. He tried to shift the focus back to my secret, asking why I never trusted him with the truth about my success. His tone sharpened slightly, grasping for footing. I told him trust is not measured by disclosure of bank balances. Trust is measured by whether someone stands beside you when you are underestimated. He inhaled sharply at that, and I saw the realization forming behind his eyes. I explained that I kept my wealth private to protect both of us from becoming defined by it. Money changes how people negotiate affection. I had seen it too many times. But tonight, wealth wasn't the issue. Character was. And I needed to know whether my son's character bent under pressure. Daniel's frustration spilled out in uneven fragments. He said growing up stable made him constantly aware of what others had that he didn't. He spoke about private schools he didn't attend and vacations his classmates took without thinking. He admitted that when he met Sophia's family, he finally felt like he had stepped into a world he had always admired from the outside. That confession softened something in me, but it also hurt deeply. I had worked relentlessly so he would never feel deprived, yet he had still internalized comparison. I realized then that humility without context can look like limitation. In trying to teach him resilience, I may have allowed him to feel less than extraordinary. He asked if I was angry with him, and the question trembled in the space between us. I told him anger would be easier than disappointment. Anger burns quickly and fades. Disappointment lingers and reshapes how you see someone. I reminded him of nights when I stayed awake finishing projects while he studied for exams, of mornings when I left before sunrise so he would never see how exhausted I was. I had built more than a company, I had built his foundation. And tonight, I felt as though he had quietly questioned its strength. He tried to apologize, but the words felt premature. Apologies without understanding are just noise. Before we could say more, the front door opened and Margaret stepped onto the porch. Her silhouette framed by warm interior light looked composed, but I sensed calculation beneath it. She called Daniel back inside, suggesting they all discuss future arrangements calmly. The shift in her tone was almost impressive. Now that she knew my financial standing, I was no longer a variable. I was an asset. I told Daniel I would not be returning inside. Some conversations do not belong in rooms designed for power plays. He hesitated, torn between two worlds, and that hesitation cut deeper than anything said at dinner. For a moment, I wondered if he would choose to walk back toward the house. He didn't. Instead, he remained standing beside me, shoulders tense but unmoving. That small decision mattered more than the revelation earlier. Margaret watched us for a long second before retreating inside, her expression unreadable. The door closed, and the estate felt less imposing without her presence. Daniel exhaled heavily, as though he had been holding his breath all evening. He said he never intended for me to feel evaluated, but he understood now that intention doesn't erase impact. I nodded slowly. Growth begins when someone stops defending themselves long enough to listen. But listening alone would not repair what had cracked tonight. I told him that wealth is not the measure of belonging in any family, but integrity is. If he could not defend me when I appeared ordinary, he did not deserve to stand proudly when I appeared powerful. The words were firm, but they were not cruel. He flinched anyway, because truth lands hardest when it aligns with private guilt. I explained that my success was never meant to overshadow him, it was meant to secure him. Yet somewhere along the way, he began measuring himself against illusions instead of values. I asked him whether Sophia knew he had allowed this evaluation to happen. His silence returned, heavier this time. The night grew colder as we stood there, both aware that this conversation was only the beginning. Daniel finally said he needed time to think, and that perhaps he had underestimated both me and himself. I told him time would not solve anything without courage. As I got into my car, I felt a mixture of sorrow and clarity settling into my chest. I had revealed my success tonight, but what truly mattered was still uncertain. My son was at a crossroads between insecurity and integrity, and the next choice he made would determine not only his marriage, but our future as mother and son. The next morning, I woke before sunrise, not because I had meetings to attend, but because my mind refused rest. I have built a life on anticipating risk, and something about the previous evening felt incomplete. Daniel's hesitation replayed in fragments, like footage slowed down for analysis. There had been something in his tone when I asked whether he knew about the prenup, something beyond agreement. It was the strain of someone carrying more than one secret. I made coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching the quiet street below. Wealth gives you options, but it does not insulate you from betrayal. And a mother's intuition, sharpened by decades of reading boardrooms, rarely misfires. By mid-morning, an old colleague returned the message I had sent the night before. He congratulated me again on handling the Callaways gracefully and casually mentioned that he was surprised they had hired an external firm before the dinner. My stomach tightened. I asked him what he meant, keeping my voice steady despite the sudden shift in air around me. He explained that a private investigative consultancy had reached out weeks earlier, requesting archived financial mentions and acquisition confirmations tied to my name. They had not contacted me directly, of course. They had simply verified my net worth, verified my holdings, verified my silence. I thanked him calmly and ended the call. I sat very still after that, feeling something colder than anger settle into my chest. The dinner had not been an introduction, it had been a confirmation of findings. They already suspected I had more than I disclosed, and instead of asking me directly, they hired someone to examine my life. What unsettled me most was not Margaret's decision to investigate. It was the realization that Daniel must have known. Investigations do not happen without proximity to information. Someone had to provide them with starting details. Someone close. I thought of the half-second pause before he admitted knowing about the prenup. Now that hesitation carried new weight. I called Daniel that afternoon and asked him to meet me. Not at his apartment. Not at a restaurant. At the park where I used to take him when he was small enough to believe I could solve anything. He arrived looking exhausted, as though sleep had also avoided him. We sat on a wooden bench facing the lake, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The air was cool, and children's laughter drifted faintly from the playground. Ordinary life continued around us, indifferent to the tension between us. Finally, I asked him a simple question. Did you know they hired someone to investigate me? His entire body stiffened before he answered. He said yes, but quickly added that he hadn't wanted it to happen that way. He claimed Margaret insisted it was standard practice for families of their standing. Standard practice. I asked whether he provided them with information to begin the search. His silence returned, heavier than before. After several long seconds, he admitted that he had shared my full name and former company details when they expressed concern about unknown variables. Unknown variables. That was what I had been reduced to in their conversations. I felt the ground shift beneath years of trust. My son had participated in a background check on his own mother. He began defending himself, saying he thought it would reassure them and prevent future conflict. He insisted he believed I had nothing to hide, so transparency would only strengthen unity. I listened without interrupting because interruption would have been mercy. When he finished, I told him that trust cannot coexist with secret scrutiny. If he had doubts about me, he should have asked directly. Instead, he allowed strangers to comb through my life as if I were applying for approval. His voice cracked when he said he never doubted me, he doubted how they would perceive me. That distinction did not comfort me. It revealed that his fear of losing status outweighed his instinct to protect me. I reminded him of the years when it was only the two of us against uncertainty. I spoke of nights when I shielded him from financial stress he never knew existed, of sacrifices he never witnessed, because I made sure he slept through them. I had trusted him with my vulnerability as a mother, even when I did not trust him with my balance sheet. And now I was learning that he had not extended the same loyalty in return. Tears gathered in his eyes, but I did not soften. Some lessons require discomfort to anchor themselves deeply enough to last. He whispered that he was trying to secure his future, and I asked him at what cost. The conversation stretched long enough for the sun to shift across the water. Daniel admitted that part of him feared being seen as less accomplished within Sophia's family. He worried they would question his ambition if his background appeared modest. I told him ambition built on insecurity becomes fragile, constantly seeking validation from those who withhold it. True confidence does not require others to shrink. He covered his face briefly, overwhelmed by the weight of realization. I saw the boy he used to be, desperate for approval, layered beneath the man trying to navigate inherited expectations. But understanding does not erase consequence. When we finally stood to leave, there was distance between us that had not existed before. Not physical distance, but emotional recalibration. Daniel asked if this meant I would withdraw from his life, and the fear in his voice sounded genuine. I told him I was not withdrawing love, I was reevaluating trust. Love is unconditional, but access is not. He absorbed that quietly, nodding as though memorizing the boundary. As I walked away from the park, I understood that the investigation had exposed more than my net worth. It had revealed the fault lines in our relationship. And those cracks, once visible, could no longer be ignored. That evening, I opened the old cedar chest at the foot of my bed, the one Daniel had not seen since he was a teenager. Inside were fragments of a life he barely remembered, utility bills marked past due from the early years, handwritten coding drafts from nights when I couldn't afford proper software, and a small stack of photographs curled at the edges. I sat on the floor and spread them around me like evidence in a trial no one else would witness. There was a photo of Daniel at 8 years old, grinning with missing front teeth, holding a science fair ribbon he thought was gold. I remembered working through that entire night before the fair, debugging a security patch for a client who had threatened to pull their contract. I still showed up at his presentation with coffee on my breath and pride in my chest. He never saw the exhaustion behind my smile. Memory has a cruel way of surfacing when trust fractures. I remembered declining social invitations because I needed to conserve funds for his education. I remembered repairing my own car to avoid mechanic fees, watching online tutorials after midnight so he wouldn't notice the strain. There were years when I measured groceries down to the cent while quietly building a company that would one day make those calculations irrelevant. Every sacrifice felt worth it because I believed I was constructing stability beneath his feet. Stability, I thought, would give him confidence. Yet somewhere along the way, he interpreted restraint as limitation. And that misinterpretation now echoed painfully in the space between us. The investigation stung, but what lingered more deeply was the implication that my life required validation from strangers. I had built encryption systems trusted by global institutions, yet my own son had allowed my character to be audited by his in-laws. I understood fear. I had navigated it countless times in business. But fear should push you to defend what matters, not compromise it. Daniel feared losing status in a family that equated legacy with superiority. In response, he compromised loyalty to prove alignment. That realization weighed heavier than any financial disclosure ever could. I wondered whether I had failed to teach him that dignity cannot be borrowed from someone else's surname. The following afternoon, Sophia requested to meet me alone. Her message was polite but urgent, and I sensed the tremor beneath her composed wording. We met at a quiet cafe far from her parents' estate, neutral ground without chandeliers or marble floors. She arrived without makeup and without the polished confidence she wore at dinner. For the first time, she looked less like a Callaway and more like a young woman navigating expectations she did not fully control. She apologized for how the evening unfolded, insisting she had not known about the private investigator until after the fact. I studied her carefully. Sincerity leaves subtle traces around the eyes. She appeared shaken, not strategic. Sophia admitted that her parents operated from fear disguised as prudence. They had built their reputation on avoiding unpredictable alliances, and Daniel's modest background had triggered scrutiny. She said Daniel believed transparency would protect everyone from suspicion, never imagining it would feel like betrayal. I listened without interrupting, weighing her words against the ache I carried. I told her that transparency without consent becomes intrusion. She nodded slowly, absorbing the distinction. There was vulnerability in her expression that softened my stance slightly. But softness does not erase consequence. I needed to know whether she would challenge her parents when necessary or quietly align with them for comfort. She surprised me by confessing that she had always admired Daniel's resilience, his ability to rise without inherited advantage. She feared that aligning too strongly with her parents' expectations would erode the very qualities she loved in him. That admission revealed cracks in her loyalty to their authority. I told her that marriage is not a merger of bank accounts, it is a test of values under pressure. If she and Daniel could not establish boundaries now, their future would be governed by external approval. Her eyes filled with quiet tears, and I saw the weight she carried as well. This was not a simple villain and victim story. It was a web of insecurities entangled with privilege. When I returned home that evening, Daniel called again. His voice sounded raw, stripped of defensiveness. He said he had confronted his parents-in-law about the investigation and demanded accountability. Margaret dismissed it as due diligence, but Daniel did not back down this time. Hearing that stirred a cautious flicker of hope inside me. Growth often arrives disguised as discomfort, and perhaps he was finally feeling its full force. Yet trust, once shaken, does not rebuild with a single act of courage. It requires consistency under pressure. I told him I was proud of him for speaking up, but pride and forgiveness are not the same thing. Later that night, I found myself standing before the window again, city lights blinking steadily below. I realized this conflict was no longer about wealth or reputation. It was about the fragile architecture of identity. Daniel had built part of his identity around entering a world that once intimidated him. In doing so, he had momentarily distanced himself from the foundation that raised him. I could not undo that choice for him. I could only decide how I would respond moving forward. And my response would need to be measured, not emotional. I had spent decades constructing security. I would not allow insecurity, his or anyone else's, to dismantle it. In the quiet of that night, I made a decision. I would not withdraw from Daniel's life, but I would establish boundaries as clear as any contract I had ever signed. Love without boundaries becomes permission for disrespect. If he wanted me fully present in his future, he would have to demonstrate loyalty not when it was convenient, but when it was costly. The next step would test him in ways no dinner table ever could. And whether he rose to that test would determine not only our relationship, but the legacy I chose to leave behind. I couldn't sleep that night because memories of Daniel's childhood came flooding back like relentless tides. I remembered nights sitting at the kitchen table, finishing coding projects while he studied for school tests, never complaining about exhaustion, never asking for recognition. I recalled the winter when the heating broke and I chose to wear extra layers rather than burden him with cold. I remembered him crying over a failed science project and me comforting him while silently worrying about unpaid invoices. Every sacrifice had been invisible, a quiet investment in his life. And now, as an adult, he had allowed strangers to evaluate me as if none of it mattered. The betrayal wasn't monetary, it was deeply personal. I realized that the past I had tried to protect him from now cast a long shadow over our present. Daniel sensed my reflection in the silence and tried to explain himself. He said he had always felt less than compared to his peers who grew up with privilege, vacations, tutors, and connections. He admitted that even our modest stability sometimes felt like a limitation to him. He confessed that this insecurity had driven his decisions with Sophia's family, that he had acted out of fear rather than judgment. I listened without interruption, because the weight of this confession needed no response. I realized then that what I had thought was mere oversight was rooted in decades of hidden comparison. I had built him a life, but he had interpreted restraint as absence. I asked him if he remembered the sacrifices I made so he could grow without privilege. He nodded, but his eyes filled with shame. He admitted that he had never truly processed them, never recognized the quiet battles I fought alone. His words hurt more than anger could have. They revealed a dissonance between memory and perception. I told him that love alone does not convey effort, that recognition requires presence and attention. If he had understood me earlier, this confrontation might not have been necessary. But the truth is, the past often resurfaces when the present demands accountability. I shared specific memories, describing nights when I skipped meals to ensure he could eat, when I repaired my own clothing instead of buying new, when I worked multiple clients at once to keep us afloat. His body stiffened with guilt, and I could feel the invisible weight of my labor pressing down on both of us. I did not shout or cry. I simply let him see, through my words, the depth of what had been invisible to him. I needed him to understand that these were not sacrifices for recognition, but for trust, stability, and the foundation of his character. By the end of that conversation, Daniel's posture had changed. He no longer seemed defensive but humbled, as though the armor of fear he had worn for years was finally cracking. I told him that understanding the past does not erase current mistakes, but it does create an opportunity to act differently going forward. If he wanted to restore integrity in our relationship, he would have to demonstrate loyalty not when convenient, but when tested. His silence this time was reflective, not evasive. For the first time in years, I sensed that he might finally grasp the true meaning of trust. I spent the next morning preparing a challenge, a test not of wealth or influence, but of character. Daniel had learned lessons from observation, but now he needed direct action. I invited him to meet me at the office I had kept even after selling my company, a place filled with files, awards, and reminders of the battles I had survived alone. The building smelled faintly of polished wood and aged paper, quiet like the calm before a storm. I told him this would not be a discussion. It would be a moment of reckoning. He nodded nervously, aware that my tone left no room for evasion. The ultimatum was simple: show loyalty and discernment, or face the consequences of continued passivity. I handed him a folder containing the same type of detailed financial and professional data the Callaways had examined. Only this time, the choice was his: respect my privacy, protect it, or treat it as a bargaining tool to impress others. His eyes widened when he saw the depth of my portfolio, the silent wealth I had cultivated, and the structures I had built for years. I watched him carefully, noting every micro-expression, the slight furrow of the brow, the tightening of his jaw, the quick blink that betrayed anxiety. This was no longer about knowledge. It was about response under pressure. Would he honor discretion, or allow fear and pride to dominate him? Daniel struggled, fumbling with words, trying to explain why he had deferred to Margaret and Sophia in the past. I interrupted gently but firmly. This is not about explanations. This is about decisions, and how you choose to act when no one is watching, when only integrity matters. He swallowed hard, realizing that the weight of his choices now extended beyond the dinner table into the very core of our relationship. I asked him if he could commit to protecting our family, defending what is ours, and acknowledging the sacrifices he had ignored. Silence stretched between us like the ticking of a clock. Finally, he nodded slowly. Not out of fear, but with the understanding of responsibility. He admitted that he had been more concerned with perception than with principle, and he vowed to make amends. I told him that trust would not be instantly restored. It must be rebuilt through consistent action. He understood, and I saw a flicker of determination in his eyes, a willingness to confront discomfort rather than avoid it. This was progress, but I knew there were further tests ahead. Life often demands not one moment of courage, but many. The tension in the room remained palpable. I reminded him that loyalty and love are not measured by presence alone, but by defense when you are underestimated. I spoke of the dinner, of the folder, and of the investigation, emphasizing that betrayal is not only malicious intent, but also silence in the face of wrongdoing. Daniel nodded again, a tremor in his voice betraying both shame and resolve. I let the moment linger, knowing that reflection is a more powerful teacher than admonishment. The lesson needed to settle in him fully, unfiltered by excuses or distraction. I ended the meeting with a warning and a promise. I would continue to observe, carefully and silently, but any further passivity in the face of disrespect toward our family or me would have consequences. Simultaneously, I offered a lifeline. Loyalty restored in action would rebuild trust stronger than before. Daniel understood that his future actions, not words, would define our relationship from this point forward. He left with a mix of relief and gravity etched across his face. I watched him go, understanding that parenting is not just guiding childhood, but shaping adulthood under pressure. Weeks later, Daniel invited me to a weekend gathering at the Callaway estate under the guise of reconciliation. I agreed, but only to observe and test whether his newfound understanding was genuine. The estate felt unchanged, grand and imposing, but the energy inside had shifted. Margaret and Richard immediately noticed my presence, and I saw subtle changes in posture and expression, smiles tighter, gestures controlled. I realized then that power had returned, but only superficially. The question now was whether Daniel's personal growth would hold under scrutiny, or if it would collapse under inherited authority. During the dinner, Margaret attempted to manipulate conversation again, probing subtly into my holdings and past decisions. She smiled as if to charm me into submission, but I remained composed, letting each word float by without reaction. Daniel, for the first time, interjected when necessary, defending my choices and redirecting attention to matters that mattered, rather than allowing evaluation to continue. I watched the transformation with quiet satisfaction, noting that courage under pressure has a visible signature, one that cannot be faked indefinitely. Margaret's expression flickered between irritation and curiosity as she realized Daniel's behavior had changed. At one point, Sophia whispered to Daniel that he was being difficult, and he replied with firmness I had never heard in him before, calmly stating that respect and privacy were not negotiable. I felt my pulse steady, observing the subtle shift in power dynamics at the table. The Callaways were unaccustomed to being challenged, and their discomfort was tangible. I had taught my son well, though the lessons were hard-earned. Daniel's evolution was no longer theoretical, it was manifest in how he navigated their probing, defending our dignity with measured grace. The collapse Margaret had hoped to induce did not occur. Yet I also observed vulnerability. Margaret's manipulations revealed cracks in their veneer of control. Richard attempted to redirect, but even he faltered when confronted by Daniel's newfound confidence. It was a rare moment to witness a family used to dominance wobble under principles, and I savored it silently. This collapse was not violent or dramatic, it was precise, subtle, psychological. They had underestimated the potency of consistent values and quiet resilience, traits that could not be quantified in wealth or lineage. By the end of the evening, Daniel and I shared a brief glance, acknowledging without words the progress made. Loyalty had been tested and defended. Integrity had stood firm. Yet I knew this was not the conclusion. Family dynamics are living entities, shifting with perception, and I would continue to monitor, guide, and challenge. This collapse, like all lessons, would solidify only if followed by consistent behavior. Daniel understood the stakes. The real test had begun not in one dinner, but in every moment that followed. After returning home, I reflected on the next move carefully. The Callaways had been exposed to consequences of underestimating me, but the story did not end with confrontation. I needed to decide what role I would continue to play in Daniel's life and his marriage. I could assert dominance, but that would risk alienating him. I could withdraw, but that would erode trust further. Instead, I chose a middle path, observation paired with selective guidance. My presence would be felt not as a threat, but as a standard to uphold. Daniel needed autonomy, but he also needed accountability. The balance would be delicate. I drafted a letter to Daniel, carefully outlining expectations without condemnation. I reminded him that loyalty is measured by action, not intention. I explained that love without boundaries allows others to manipulate relationships unconsciously. I emphasized that privacy, integrity, and discernment would govern how I interacted moving forward. It was not a punishment, but a framework, one designed to guide him toward the adult behavior he had momentarily forgotten. He read it quietly, nodding, absorbing every word, though I could see the weight of the responsibility settling on him. The next week, I observed small but meaningful actions. Daniel no longer allowed Sophia's parents to dominate decisions in casual conversation. He referenced my insights with respect, no longer hiding my expertise or minimizing my influence. Every measured step was reinforcement of the lesson learned. Trust and integrity are validated over time, not declared in moments. The difference between words and deeds had been illustrated fully. I recognized that the hardest part of leadership, whether as a parent or executive, is watching growth develop under uncertainty. Finally, I made a personal decision about my presence in their lives. I would participate, guide, and occasionally challenge, but I would no longer tolerate silent compromise of values. My role would be clear: protector of integrity, custodian of dignity, and mother who insists on recognition when respect is required. Daniel understood, visibly relieved and apprehensive, but willing to accept the terms. In setting these boundaries, I restored not just authority, but a quiet equilibrium that allowed both independence and oversight to coexist. Several months later, an event forced the ultimate confrontation. Margaret, sensing Daniel's growing independence, attempted to orchestrate another test during a family gathering. I observed quietly, noting each manipulation, each subtle attempt to assert superiority. When she pressed Daniel about private financial decisions again, he stood firmly, citing our framework of loyalty and discretion. Margaret's composure faltered. For the first time, she realized her influence over him had limits. Her whispered insistences, her strategic glances, even Richard's attempts at subtle intimidation, all failed. I chose that moment to speak, not to dominate, but to clarify principles. I addressed the family with calm authority, explaining that wealth and lineage are insufficient measures of character. I reminded them that integrity is earned, loyalty is tested, and respect cannot be assumed. Each word landed like deliberate strikes, subtle but irrevocable. Margaret's face paled as she absorbed the lesson. Richard's jaw tightened. Daniel stood beside me, shoulders squared, eyes steady. The man I had trained through trust, confrontation, and reflection fully realized. The breaking scene was not about humiliation, it was about the revelation of principle over perception, and it left the room unsettled. By the end of that evening, the hierarchy of influence had shifted permanently. Daniel had proven loyalty and courage under pressure. The Calloways recognized that character and discretion outweigh inherited wealth. I had restored trust, repaired fractures, and asserted the power of experience without dominating. And in the quiet that followed, I realized that the greatest lesson was not to outsiders, but to my son. Strength is silent, tested, and sustained through choices that align with values. The morning after the breaking scene, I woke to quiet sunlight spilling across my townhouse. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm I had not allowed myself to experience since the dinner with the Calloways. Daniel had grown visibly over the past months, proving that loyalty and integrity could survive pressure. But I knew true transformation requires more than one moment of courage. It requires continuous choices, even when no one is watching. As I sipped my coffee, I reflected on what had been tested, what had been broken, and what had been rebuilt. Trust is fragile, but it can be stronger when mended deliberately. I called Daniel into the kitchen, and we sat across from one another at the small wooden table I had bought years ago, the one that had witnessed countless nights of silent sacrifice. I didn't scold, nor did I lecture. I simply asked him what he had learned through these months of tension and observation. He hesitated, then admitted that he had underestimated the depth of responsibility in defending family and values, that he had believed love alone could smooth over insecurity, and that he now understood the courage it takes to act with principle even when fear tempts compromise. I nodded, allowing the weight of his admission to settle between us. I reminded him that life does not offer a single redemption, it offers countless moments in which to act rightly. Each choice, each measured response, builds the legacy of character, not the legacy of wealth. I told him that our story, our lives together, and our actions with the Calloways would now define the boundaries of respect. Daniel listened, eyes steady for the first time, understanding that growth is not inherited but earned. There was pride in his gaze, tempered with humility, and I realized the lesson had fully taken root. Later that afternoon, I received a call from Sophia. She spoke with a quiet, sincere tone, expressing gratitude for the clarity that had emerged. She admitted that she had initially feared my presence, fearing judgment or conflict. But now she respected the boundaries and principles I had established. I told her that respect is not demanded, it is demonstrated over time through consistent integrity. Our conversation was brief, but it confirmed that influence rooted in principle far outlasts influence rooted in authority. Sophia's acknowledgement of my role in shaping their family dynamics gave me a subtle satisfaction, one that wealth alone could never provide. Over the next few weeks, Daniel and I observed how interactions with the Callaways changed. Margaret and Richard, initially intent on oversight and control, began adjusting their expectations, treating us as equals rather than curiosities. Their gestures of authority softened, no longer cloaked in subtle intimidation. Daniel now participated as a confident partner, capable of defending values without fear of external judgment. The shift was tangible. Where tension had once dominated conversations, respect now prevailed. Observing these changes, I felt the quiet triumph of teaching through principle rather than dominance. One evening, as we prepared dinner at home, Daniel admitted that he had felt shame in the past, not for what he lacked, but for misunderstanding the strength I had quietly cultivated for both of us. I told him that shame is only useful when it catalyzes reflection, not paralysis. He nodded, understanding the distinction, and we shared a long, unspoken acknowledgement. The past cannot be rewritten, but the present and future are ours to shape consciously. In that moment, I felt the full weight of what we had endured together, the fractures healed by deliberate truth, accountability, and courage. I began organizing my estate and personal legacy with renewed clarity. Wealth alone is transient, but the lessons we leave, values, principles, and boundaries persist. I documented the steps I had taken to safeguard integrity, and I ensured that Daniel, as my son, would inherit not just assets, but a blueprint for moral resilience. I realized that teaching him to act under pressure, to choose loyalty over fear, was perhaps the most significant inheritance of all. This exercise was as much about shaping him as a man as it was about protecting him from manipulation by others. Months later, a family gathering brought the Callaways together once more. The air was still formal, but the dynamics had shifted entirely. Daniel addressed his in-laws with calm authority, advocating for fairness and respect, while I remained present as a quiet anchor of support. Margaret and Richard, for all their tradition and expectation, now navigated the room with caution rather than command. Their subtle intimidation had been replaced by tentative respect, and I observed that balance had been restored not through confrontation alone, but through consistency and demonstration of principle. That evening, Daniel thanked me privately. He said that he now fully appreciated the sacrifices I had made, the vigilance I had maintained, and the guidance I had provided through silence, patience, and deliberate testing. I told him that recognition is not required for love to exist, but understanding strengthens connection immeasurably. Our bond, once tested by fear, comparison, and external influence, had now been reinforced by clarity, trust, and mutual respect. I saw him transformed, and I understood that the legacy I had built, both in life and in lessons, was secure in capable hands. As I finally went to bed, I reflected on the full journey, from secret wealth to quiet observation, from betrayal to confrontation, from fractures to reconciliation. I realized that true power is silent, tested, and sustained through integrity, and that love is proven not by comfort, but by how it endures pressure. I felt a sense of completion, not because the challenges had ended, but because the foundation for all future challenges was now unshakable. Daniel, the Callaways, and I had all been measured, and for the first time, the scale rested not in privilege, but in principle. And in that balance, I found peace.